My brother kept secrets for the church for 23 years. 3 weeks after his funeral, I found out he'd been keeping one from them too. I'm holding the letter now, sitting in my home office in Mesa, Arizona, the same office where I spent 12 years balancing ward budgets and reconciling tithing receipts as the financial clerk. My hands won't stop shaking. The paper is cream-colored, expensive, the kind David always used for important correspondence. My name is written across the top in his careful handwriting. Marcus. Just that. No dear, no formality. Like he knew I'd understand. But I don't understand. Not yet. Let me go back to the beginning. Let me tell you about the day we buried my brother, and the box that changed everything I thought I knew about my faith, my family, and the institution I'd given my entire adult life to serve. David passed on a Tuesday in November. Heart attack, they said. Massive. He was 61 years old, 7 years my senior, and he died alone in his office on the 15th floor of the church office building in Salt Lake City. They found him at his desk, slumped over a stack of reports, his temple recommends still in his wallet, valid for another 18 months he'd never use. The funeral was 4 days later. I drove up from Mesa with my wife Linda, through the Arizona desert and into the red rocks of southern Utah, then north past Provo and into the valley where our people had settled nearly 200 years ago. The Salt Lake Temple rose against a gray November sky as we pulled into the city, its spires catching what little light broke through the clouds. I'd seen that temple 1,000 times in my life. But that day, it looked different to me. Colder somehow. Like it was keeping something. The service was held at a stake center near the avenues, one of those older brick buildings with the kind of craftsmanship they don't bother with anymore. David had requested a simple service. No viewing, closed casket. That was strange for a man who'd always done everything by the book. In our culture, you show the body. You let people say goodbye. But David's instructions had been specific, written in a letter he'd left with his attorney 3 years before he died. Like he'd known something was coming. The chapel was packed, standing room only. I recognized faces from every stage of David's life, mission companions from Germany, BYU roommates, colleagues from the church's finance division. There were general authority 70s in attendance, a member of the presiding bishopric, men in dark suits who nodded solemnly and spoke in hushed tones about what a faithful servant David had been, how devoted, how trustworthy. I sat in the front row with Linda on one side and David's widow Catherine on the other. Catherine hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to me since I'd arrived. She looked hollowed out, like someone had reached inside her and scooped out everything that made her Catherine. I held her hand during the opening hymn, "Come, come, ye saints," and felt nothing but bone and cold skin. The bishop spoke first, then a counselor from David's ward. Then a representative from church headquarters, a man named Elder Jensen who'd worked with David for 15 years in the investment division. They all said the same things. Faithful, dedicated, a man who magnified his calling, a man who understood the sacred nature of his stewardship. Stewardship. That word kept coming up. It's a word we use a lot in the church. It means you're taking care of something that belongs to someone else. To God, ultimately. Your family, your calling, your resources, they're all on loan. You're the steward, not the owner. I'd been a steward my whole life. Steward of my family, steward of my career as a corporate accountant, steward of the ward finances for 12 years, tracking every dollar that came in through tithing envelopes and every dollar that went out for activities and maintenance. I understood stewardship. I believed in it. But sitting in that chapel, listening to men in expensive suits talk about my brother's faithful service, I felt something I couldn't name. A pebble in my shoe, a splinter under the skin, something small and sharp that wouldn't let me settle. After the graveside service, after the luncheon in the cultural hall where sisters from the Relief Society served ham sandwiches and funeral potatoes, after the endless parade of handshakes and murmured condolences, Catherine pulled me aside. We were standing in the hallway near the bishop's office, away from the crowd. She looked worse than she had during the service. Her mascara had run and dried in dark tracks down her cheeks. Her hands were trembling. "Marcus," she said, "there's something I need to give you." I waited. David left instructions, very specific instructions. She took a breath that seemed to cost her something. He said if anything happened to him, I was to give you a box from his study. Not the children. Not the bishop. Not anyone from his office. You. What kind of box? I don't know. Her voice cracked. He made me promise not to open it. He made me promise 3 years ago, Marcus. 3 years. Like he knew. She grabbed my arm, and her grip was stronger than I expected. He said you'd understand. He said you were the only one who would understand. I didn't understand, but I nodded anyway. An hour later, I was standing in David's study in his home in the Federal Heights neighborhood, a quiet street with mature trees and houses that cost more than I'd earn in a decade. The study was exactly what you'd expect from a man like David. Dark wood bookshelves lined with scriptures, church history, and financial texts. A mahogany desk that had belonged to our father. A painting of the Salt Lake Temple on the wall, the same one that hung in thousands of Latter-day Saint homes across the world. Catherine stood in the doorway, watching me. She pointed to the closet. "Top shelf," she said. "Behind the old missionary journals." I found it easily. A banker's box, the kind you'd use to store tax records or old photographs. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to the desk and set it down, and Catherine took a step backward like she was afraid of what might come out. "I'll leave you alone," she said. And then she was gone, closing the door behind her with a soft click. I stood there for a long time, looking at that box. The lid was taped shut with clear packing tape, the kind you can't pull off cleanly. David had written something on the top in black marker, but time had faded it. I could only make out 2 words. For Marcus. I thought about my brother, the boy who'd taught me to ride a bike in our backyard in Provo. The teenager who'd borne his testimony at every fast Sunday, his voice cracking with conviction. The missionary who'd baptized 47 people in Munich and come home burning with faith. The man who'd devoted his entire career to the church, rising through the ranks of its financial apparatus until he occupied an office most members didn't even know existed. David had always been the believer. The true believer. The one who never questioned, never doubted, never wavered. He was the son our father held up as the example. The one our mother prayed would become a general authority someday. The golden child of a golden family and a faith that rewards golden children with positions of trust and influence. And he'd left this box for me. Not for Catherine. Not for his children. Not for his colleagues at church headquarters. For me, the younger brother who'd spent his career in corporate accounting instead of church service. The one who'd served faithfully but quietly, without ambition, without aspiration to leadership. The one David used to call the honest one when we were boys. I pulled the tape off the box and opened the lid. Inside I found chaos. Not the organized files I'd expected from a man like David. Instead, there were loose papers, folders with handwritten labels, spreadsheets printed on old dot matrix paper, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and USB drives held together with rubber bands. It looked like someone had emptied a filing cabinet into the box without any thought to organization. And on top of it all, sealed in a plain white envelope, was the letter. The one I'm holding now, 3 weeks later, as I try to make sense of what my brother left behind. I didn't read it that day. I couldn't. Catherine knocked on the door after 20 minutes asking if I was all right, and I told her I needed to take the box home. She didn't argue. I think she was relieved to have it out of her house. Linda and I drove back to Mesa that night, the box in the trunk of our car, and I didn't tell her what was in it. I didn't know what was in it, not really, just papers, just numbers, just the fragments of whatever had consumed my brother's final years. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage to start reading. I began with the spreadsheets. That's what I know. Numbers, columns, rows. The language of money, which is the same in every country and every culture. A dollar is a dollar is a dollar, and a lie is a lie is a lie, and the numbers always tell you which is which if you know how to listen. The first spreadsheet was dated 2019. It showed assets under management for an entity called Ensign Peak Advisors. I'd heard the name before, vaguely, in the context of church investments, but I'd never paid much attention. I assumed it was like any other institutional investor, managing the church's reserves to generate returns that would fund operations during lean years. The number at the bottom of the spreadsheet stopped me cold. $100 billion. I read it again, then again. Then I pulled out my calculator and checked the math, adding up the line items, the equity positions, the bond holdings, the real estate investments. The total came out the same. $100 billion, managed by a single entity on behalf of a church that asked its members to sacrifice 10% of their income before paying rent or buying groceries for their children. But that was 2019. The documents went deeper, and the numbers got bigger. By 2024, according to David's records, the publicly disclosed stock portfolio alone had grown to nearly $60 billion. But that was just what the church was required to report to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The actual total, including real estate, private equity, international holdings, and assets held through affiliated entities, had swelled to somewhere between $200 and $300 billion. The Widows' Mite Report, an independent website devoted to tracking church finances, projected that at current rates of growth, the church would be worth more than $1 trillion sometime in the 2040s. $1 trillion for a church of 17.5 million members. A church that still asks elderly widows to pay tithing on their Social Security checks. A church that eliminated paid janitors and now asks members to clean their own meeting houses on Saturday mornings. A church that expects young men and women to finance their own 2-year missions, paying thousands of dollars for the privilege of knocking on doors in foreign countries. I'd paid tithing my entire adult life. So had Linda. I sat down one evening and calculated the total, including estimated investment returns if we'd put that money into index funds instead. We'd given the church over $400,000. $400,000 from a middle-class family in Arizona, while the church sat on a mountain of wealth larger than the GDP of most countries. But I had no idea what was coming next. I opened the letter on a Thursday night in December, after Linda had gone to bed. I sat in my office with a cup of herbal tea going cold on my desk, and I read my brother's words, and when I finished, I sat in the dark for a very long time. The letter began like this: Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm dead. I'm sorry for the dramatic opening, but I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you isn't speculation. It isn't rumor. It's what I saw with my own eyes over 23 years inside the financial apparatus of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm not writing this to destroy the church. I love the church. I love the gospel. I love the Savior whose name the church bears. But I've spent the last 5 years wrestling with something I can't resolve, and I need someone to understand why. The church is building an empire, Marcus. Not a kingdom of God on earth, but a financial empire designed to outlast nations, and the members who fund it with their tithes and offerings have no idea how vast it has become or what it's being built for. I'm going to tell you about 7 pillars. 7 strategies that will guarantee the church remains the wealthiest religious institution on the planet for the next century or longer. By the time you finish reading these documents, you'll understand why I couldn't send this letter while I was alive. And you'll understand the question I couldn't answer, the question that haunted me every night for the last 3 years of my life. Is it wrong to build a kingdom if you truly believe it will save the world? I started reading the first page. By the 3rd paragraph, I understood why David never sent this letter, and why he couldn't destroy it either. The documents David left were not organized chronologically. They were organized by what he called pillars, 7 strategic foundations that, according to his analysis, would ensure the church's financial dominance for generations to come. He'd numbered them in red ink on manila folders, each one stuffed with printouts, internal memos, and his own handwritten notes in the margins. I started with Pillar 1. It was labeled simply, the tithe. Now I need to explain something about tithing for those who might not understand its place in our faith. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, tithing isn't optional. It isn't a suggestion. It's a commandment, a covenant requirement, and the price of admission to the temple. If you don't pay a full tithe, 10% of your income, you cannot receive a temple recommend. Without a temple recommend, you cannot be sealed to your spouse and children for eternity. You cannot participate in the most sacred ordinances of the faith. You are, in a very real sense, spiritually incomplete. I paid my first tithe when I was 8 years old, from the $5 my grandmother gave me for my birthday. I've paid ever since. Every paycheck, every bonus, every tax refund. 10% off the top, before taxes, because that's how my father taught me, and his father taught him. Gross income, not net. The Lord's share comes first. Linda and I raised 4 children on a single income for most of our marriage. There were years when tithing meant choosing between new shoes for the kids and keeping the lights on. But we paid. We always paid. Because that's what faithful members do. That's what the prophets have counseled since Lorenzo Snow stood at the pulpit in 1899 and called the saints to renew their commitment to the law of tithing. David's documents showed me where all those dollars went. According to his estimates compiled from internal reports and cross-referenced with independent analyses, the church receives between $6 and $7 billion annually in tithing and other donations. $6 to $7 billion every year. From members who believe, as I believed, that their contributions are building temples, funding missionary work, and helping the poor. And here's what David's records revealed. The church spends approximately $5 to $6 billion per year on its actual operations. Missionary program, temple construction and maintenance, education, welfare, the entire global apparatus of a 17 million member faith, which means every single year the church banks a surplus of roughly $1 billion from tithing alone. $1 billion. Every year, for decades. I thought about my own contributions. The $400,000 my family had given over a lifetime. I thought about the sister in our ward who cleaned houses for a living and still paid tithing on every dollar before she bought food for her kids. I thought about the retired couples I knew who paid tithing on their Social Security checks, their pensions, their meager savings account interest, because they'd been taught that faithfulness in small things leads to blessings in large ones. We gave because we believed it was going to God's work, and it was, partially. But a significant portion was going somewhere else entirely. It was going into the largest religious investment fund in the world. I moved to the second folder. Pillar 2. David had labeled it Ensign Peak. The name comes from a hill overlooking Salt Lake City, the place where Brigham Young reportedly climbed and surveyed the valley that would become Zion. Ensign Peak Advisors was incorporated in 1997 as the church's investment management arm. For more than 20 years, almost nobody outside church headquarters knew it existed. No public filings, no disclosure. Just a quiet office building in downtown Salt Lake, where a team of professional money managers invested the church's surplus tithing in stocks, bonds, real estate, and other assets. Then, in 2019, a whistleblower came forward. David had included copies of the news articles in his files. A former Ensign Peak employee named David Nielsen, no relation to us, filed a complaint with the IRS alleging that the church had accumulated more than $100 billion in investment reserves, money that had been donated for charitable purposes, but was instead being stockpiled in a massive fund that made almost no charitable distributions. The story exploded. The Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, 60 Minutes. For the first time, the world got a glimpse of the financial machinery humming beneath the surface of a faith that preached sacrifice and self-reliance to its members. But what the public didn't know, what David's documents revealed, was that the $100 billion figure was just the beginning. By 2024, according to SEC filings that Ensign Peak was now required to submit, the publicly disclosed stock portfolio alone had grown to nearly $60 billion. That represented investments in Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Google, Amazon, and hundreds of other companies. The church's single largest holding was in Nvidia, the artificial intelligence chipmaker, worth nearly $4.5 billion. Its positions in Apple and Microsoft were each worth over $3 billion. But the stock portfolio was only part of the picture. According to the Widow's Mite report and David's own calculations, when you added in real estate holdings, international investments, private equity, and assets held through affiliated companies, the church's total investment reserves exceeded $200 billion. To put that in perspective, Harvard University, with the largest academic endowment in the world, manages about $50 billion. The church's investment reserves are 4 times larger. And unlike Harvard, the church pays no taxes on its investment gains. I sat with those numbers for a long time. I'm an accountant. I understand compound interest. I understand the power of patient capital invested over decades. But understanding something intellectually is different from feeling it in your bones, from recognizing what it means for your own life and the lives of everyone you've ever known in the faith. Every Sunday for 35 years I'd sat in sacrament meeting and listened to talks about the widow's mite, the poor woman in the Bible who gave her last 2 coins to the temple treasury, while the rich gave from their surplus. We were taught that her sacrifice was pleasing to God because she gave everything she had. We were taught to be like her. And all that time, our mites were being collected and invested by professionals in a fund that could buy and sell most nations on earth. Have you ever felt trapped between who you were supposed to be and who you really are? That's what I felt reading those numbers. I was supposed to be a faithful member who didn't question, who trusted the brethren, who believed that every dollar I gave was being used wisely for the Lord's purposes. But I was also an accountant who could read a balance sheet, who understood that a $200 billion reserve fund generates more in annual investment returns than the church receives in tithing. Think about that. The church's investments now generate more money each year than 17 million members contribute in tithes. I opened the 3rd folder, Pillar 3. David had labeled it, The Fortress. This section was shorter than the others, but its implications were profound. It documented something I'd always taken for granted but never really thought about. The church carries 0 institutional debt. 0. No mortgages on temples. No bonds issued to fund construction. No credit lines. No loans. No financial obligations to any bank or government or outside entity. The church owns everything it has outright and owes nothing to anyone. This wasn't always the case. In the 1960s, under President David O. McKay, the church had expanded aggressively, building chapels and temples around the world, and it had gone into debt to do so. By 1962, the church was running annual deficits of $32 million, a significant sum at the time. Then N. Eldon Tanner took over as a counselor in the first presidency. Tanner was a Canadian businessman, a former cabinet minister in the Alberta government, and a financial conservative who believed institutions should live within their means. He instituted a policy that the church has followed ever since. Operating expenses would always be covered by annual tithing revenue. Surpluses would be invested. Debts would be eliminated. The church would never again be dependent on outside financing. By 1970, the debt was gone. It has never returned. I thought about what that meant. I thought about corporations that leverage debt to grow, that borrow against future earnings to fund current operations. I thought about governments that issue bonds and run deficits, that are perpetually beholden to their creditors. And I thought about the church, sitting on a mountain of cash and assets, answering to no one, dependent on nothing but the continued faith of its members. David had written a note in the margin of this section. They can wait forever. They don't need anything from anyone. That's the power of the fortress. No siege can break it because they have no needs that can be denied. I closed the folder and sat back in my chair. It was past midnight. The house was silent. Linda was asleep upstairs, and I was alone with my brother's secrets, trying to make sense of what I was reading. So far, everything David had documented was troubling but not illegal, not even unethical, depending on your perspective. Churches are allowed to invest their reserves, they're allowed to accumulate wealth, they're allowed to operate in secrecy. The law gives religious organizations enormous latitude in how they manage their finances, and the church had taken full advantage of that latitude. But then I opened Pillar 4, and I began to understand why David had felt the need to document everything. Why he'd kept this box hidden in his closet for years. Why he'd made Catherine promise to give it to me, and no one else. Pillar 4 was labeled The Land. The first document was a map. It showed the state of Florida, with large sections colored in green. The green represented land owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints through its agricultural subsidiaries, primarily Deseret Ranches and Ag Reserves, Inc. The total acreage, more than 670,000 acres. The church is the largest private landowner in Florida. Let me say that again, because it took me several readings to absorb it. A Utah-based church founded in the 19th century is the single largest private landowner in the state of Florida. More than 2% of the state's entire land mass belongs to entities controlled by the church. The acquisition had happened in two major phases. The first was in 1950, when the church purchased what would become Deseret Ranches, nearly 300,000 acres of cattle pasture, timberland, and citrus groves in central Florida, stretching across Brevard, Orange, and Osceola counties. Today, Deseret Ranches operates one of the largest cow-calf operations in the nation, with more than 40,000 head of cattle. The second phase came in 2013 when Ag Reserves, Inc., a tax-paying church affiliate, purchased nearly 400,000 acres of timberland in the Florida Panhandle from the St. Joe Company for $565 million. The land stretches across 9 counties, from just outside Tallahassee to the outskirts of Panama City. But Florida was just the beginning. David's documents showed church land holdings in Nebraska, Montana, Texas, Utah, Oklahoma, and dozens of other states. The church owns massive orchards in California, making it one of the nation's largest nut producers. It owns hunting preserves in Utah and Wyoming. It owns commercial real estate in major cities across the country, including the land beneath the shopping centers and office towers that generate rental income year after year. According to one analysis David had included, the church owns at least 2.3 million acres of land in the United States alone. That would make it the second largest private landowner in the country, behind only the Emerson family's Sierra Pacific Industries. And then there was City Creek Center. I'd visited City Creek once, about 10 years ago, when Linda and I went to Salt Lake for General Conference. It's a massive upscale shopping mall in the heart of downtown, directly across the street from Temple Square. Nordstrom, Tiffany, Macy's, a retractable glass roof that opens in good weather. A man-made creek running through the center, stocked with fish, surrounded by carefully landscaped gardens. The church built it, not a developer, not a consortium of investors. The church itself, through its real estate arm, City Creek Reserve, Inc. The cost, somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion, depending on which estimate you believe. The total investment in revitalizing downtown Salt Lake City, approximately $5 billion. When the mall opened in 2012, President Thomas S. Monson attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The prophet of the church, the man we sustained as God's mouthpiece on earth, stood before a crowd of dignitaries and shoppers, and as the ribbon fell, he raised his arms and shouted, "Let's go shopping, let's go shopping," from the mouth of a prophet. I remembered hearing about that moment when it happened. I remembered the jokes, the memes, the uncomfortable laughter from members who didn't quite know how to process the image of their prophet celebrating a luxury mall. But I'd pushed it aside, like we push aside so many things that don't fit the narrative we need to believe. Now, sitting with David's documents spread across my desk, I couldn't push it aside anymore. The church had claimed, repeatedly and publicly, that no tithing funds were used to build City Creek. The money came from commercial investments, they said, from business income, from sources separate and distinct from the sacred donations of the members. But David's notes told a different story. According to the whistleblower complaint filed with the IRS, Ensign Peak had invested approximately $1.5 billion in the City Creek project. And inside Ensign Peak, according to the whistleblower, who had worked there as a senior portfolio manager, every dollar was referred to as tithing money. Every penny was called the widow's mite, because it all came from the same source: the faithful contributions of members who believed their money was being used to build the kingdom of God. I closed the folder. My hands were shaking again, the way they'd shaken when I first opened the box 3 weeks ago. I walked to the window and looked out at the Arizona night, the lights of Mesa spreading across the valley, the faint glow of Phoenix in the distance. I'd spent 35 years believing something that might not be true, or rather, believing a version of truth that had been carefully curated, selectively presented, strategically managed. The church was wealthy, far wealthier than I'd ever imagined. And the people making decisions about that wealth had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep its size and scope hidden from the members who had funded it. But I had no idea what was coming next. The first 4 pillars were about money, how the church accumulated it, invested it, protected it. The next 3 pillars were about something else entirely. They were about power, about growth, about building an institution designed to outlast everything. I walked into that room not knowing it would be the last time I'd see my faith as the woman I thought she was. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my office until the first gray light of dawn crept through the blinds, reading and rereading David's documents, trying to find a flaw in his logic, an error in his calculations, something that would let me dismiss what I was seeing as the delusions of a troubled man. I found nothing. Every number was sourced. Every claim was documented. My brother had been meticulous, obsessively so, in building his case, and the case was damning. But the financial pillars were only half the story. When I opened the 5th folder, labeled The Harvest, I began to understand that the church's wealth wasn't just about money. It was about people. Specifically, it was about creating a self-sustaining system for producing new members, new believers, new contributors to the tithing base that funded everything else. Pillar 5 documented what David called engineered growth. Let me start with the missionaries. At any given time, the church has approximately 74,000 full-time missionaries serving around the world, with numbers that have recently climbed toward 80,000. These are mostly young men between 18 and 20, and young women starting at 19, who leave their homes for 18 months to 2 years to proselytize in cities and villages across more than 150 countries. Here's what most people don't realize about LDS missionaries. They're not paid. They pay to serve. Each missionary, or more often, their family, contributes several $100s per month to cover living expenses during their service. The church pools these contributions into a general missionary fund, but the expectation is clear. You finance your own mission. Families begin saving when their children are toddlers, setting aside money in dedicated accounts so that when their son or daughter receives their mission call, the funds will be ready. I did the math. 74,000 missionaries, each serving an average of 20 months at a cost of roughly $500 per month, equals approximately $740 million annually, paid by the missionaries themselves or their families, not by the church. Nearly $750 million in labor costs, externalized to the very people doing the work. And what do these missionaries do? They knock on doors. They teach discussions. They invite people to be baptized into the church, which means those new converts will begin paying tithing, attending services, and potentially sending their own children on missions in 20 years. The missionaries are, in effect, an unpaid sales force recruiting future contributors to the system that recruited them. David had written a note in the margin. It's not a pyramid scheme, but if you drew it as a diagram, it would look exactly like one. I winced when I read that. It felt disloyal, sacrilegious even. I'd served a mission myself in the Philippines from 1985 to 1987, two of the most difficult and most meaningful years of my life. I'd baptized 23 people. I'd learned to speak Tagalog. I'd grown from a sheltered boy into something resembling a man, and I'd paid for it myself, working summers during high school, saving every dollar I earned at the grocery store where I bagged groceries and stocked shelves. I didn't regret my mission. I still don't. But reading David's analysis, I couldn't escape the economic reality of what I'd participated in. I had paid for the privilege of recruiting new members who would, in turn, fund the institution that had sent me to recruit them. The beauty of the system was its elegance. The horror of it was the same. But the missionaries were just one piece of the growth strategy. The next section of Pillar 5 dealt with demographics. Large families have always been a hallmark of Mormon culture. Multiply and replenish the earth isn't just a biblical injunction, it's a lived reality in LDS communities. The average Mormon family has more children than the national average. In previous generations, 5, 6, 7 children were common. Even today, with birth rates declining across American society, Mormon families tend to be larger than their secular counterparts. This isn't accidental. Church leaders have consistently taught that bearing and raising children is a sacred responsibility, a commandment from God. General conference talks extol the virtues of motherhood. Young women are taught from childhood that their highest calling is to become wives and mothers. Young men are told that providing for a family is their priesthood duty. The result is a demographic engine. Every generation of Latter-day Saints produces a larger generation to follow. And while retention rates aren't perfect, David's documents showed that perhaps a third of young people raised in the church eventually become inactive. The sheer volume of births means the membership rolls continue to grow. 17.5 million members and counting. But the real growth isn't happening in Utah anymore. It's happening in Africa, in Latin America, in the Philippines and Brazil and Nigeria and Ghana. The church has discovered what every successful multinational corporation eventually learns. The future is in emerging markets. David had included printouts of church growth statistics for the past 2 decades. The patterns were clear. While membership growth in the United States and Europe had slowed to a crawl, growth in the developing world was accelerating. In 2024 alone, the church reported over 308,000 convert baptisms, the highest number in nearly 3 decades. And the vast majority of those converts came from countries where a monthly tithing payment might represent a significant portion of a family's income. I thought about what that meant. A farmer in rural Ghana who joins the church commits to giving 10% of his income for the rest of his life. His children will be raised in the faith. They'll serve missions if they can afford to. They'll marry in the temple. They'll have large families. And they'll all pay tithing, generation after generation, flowing upward into a fund managed by professionals in Salt Lake City who invested in Apple stock and Florida timberland. It was brilliant, ruthless, utterly effective. And then I opened Pillar 6. The folder was thicker than the others, stuffed with printouts and handwritten calculations. David had circled the label 3 times in red ink, and beneath it, he'd written 2 words. This one. Pillar 6 was labeled the invisible labor force. If stories like this resonate with you, stories that ask the questions we were never supposed to ask, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel. There are many more untold stories waiting to be shared. Let me tell you about the unpaid army that keeps the church running. Start with the local leadership. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there is no professional clergy at the congregational level. Bishops, the leaders of local wards, are volunteers. They work full-time jobs during the week and then spend 20, 30, sometimes 40 hours on church duties. They conduct interviews. They counsel struggling members. They manage budgets. They oversee welfare assistance. They visit the sick and comfort the grieving. They do all of this without receiving a single dollar in compensation. The same is true for stake presidents, who oversee multiple wards. For Relief Society presidents who lead the women's organization. For young men and young women leaders, primary teachers, Sunday school instructors, ward mission leaders, employment specialists, family history consultants, and dozens of other callings that keep the institution functioning. I calculated my own service once just out of curiosity. Over 35 years as an active member, I'd held callings that consumed an average of 10 to 15 hours per week. Sunday meetings, weeknight activities, Saturday service projects, home teaching visits, later called ministering, ward council meetings, stake leadership training, temple service. 35 years at an average of 12 hours per week equals approximately 22,000 hours of labor. At minimum wage, that's over $350,000 of work I donated to the church, and my service was modest compared to many. I'd never been a bishop, never served in a stake presidency. The men who hold those callings often describe their service as a second full-time job, one that pays nothing. But the most remarkable element of the unpaid labor force, the one that made David circle this folder 3 times, was the building maintenance program. In 2000, the church made a decision that saved it hundreds of millions of dollars. It laid off most of its professional custodial staff and transferred the responsibility for cleaning meeting houses to the members themselves. Today, in wards across the world, families are assigned to clean their local chapel on a rotating basis. They show up on Saturday mornings with mops and vacuums. They scrub toilets. They empty trash cans. They vacuum the chapel where they'll worship the next day. Children as young as 8 participate, learning early that service to the church means physical labor without compensation. The church describes this as a spiritual opportunity, a chance to develop gratitude for sacred spaces. A way to build community and teach children the value of work. Critics see it differently. They see a multi-billion-dollar institution asking middle-class families to perform janitorial work, while it sits on investment reserves larger than the GDP of many nations. In 1995, before the custodial program was eliminated, the church's Human Resources Department estimated that its 96,000 volunteers contributed services worth approximately $360 million annually. That was 30 years ago. The church has grown significantly since then. The savings today are almost certainly far larger. David had written a note at the bottom of this section, and it was the one that stayed with me longest. I calculated it once. Over 35 years, I donated at least 8,000 hours to the church. I never thought of it as labor. I thought of it as love. And maybe it was. Maybe that's the genius of the whole system. They've made us believe that working for free is a privilege, that giving our time and money and energy without compensation is a blessing, not an exploitation. And because we believe it, because we genuinely believe it, the system works, the machine keeps running, and the fund keeps growing. I put down the folder. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. The sun was fully up now, light streaming through the window, and I could hear Linda moving around upstairs, starting her morning routine. In a few minutes, she'd come downstairs and ask if I wanted breakfast. She'd see the papers spread across my desk, the folders and spreadsheets and USB drives, and she'd ask what I was working on. What would I tell her? How do you explain to your wife of 32 years that everything you both believed, everything you sacrificed for, everything you taught your children, that all of it was built on a foundation neither of you ever truly understood? I thought about the temple, our temple. The Mesa, Arizona temple, where Linda and I were sealed in 1992, where we'd brought each of our 4 children to be sealed to us as a family, where I'd performed proxy ordinances for my dead ancestors on more Saturday mornings than I could count. I loved that temple. I still do. I love the peace I feel when I walk through its doors. I love the white clothing and the hushed voices and the sense of being somewhere sacred, somewhere separate from the noise and chaos of the world. I love sitting in the celestial room after a session, feeling close to something I can't name but have always believed was real. And I loved the church. Despite everything I was reading, despite the numbers and the strategies and the cold financial logic of it all, I loved the community it had given me, the friends, the sense of belonging, the framework for understanding my place in the universe. I loved singing hymns on Sunday morning and passing the sacrament bread to my neighbors and hearing my children bear their testimonies on Fast Sunday. How do you reconcile love with betrayal? How do you hold both things at once, the genuine good that an institution has brought into your life, and the dawning realization that the institution has not been honest with you about who it is and what it's doing? I didn't have answers. I still don't. But I had one more folder to open. Pillar 7. The one David had saved for last. The one that would keep me awake for many more nights to come. I'd love to know, what moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was there something here that made you think about your own experience? Tell me in the comments. The folder was thin, just a few pages, but the label made my stomach drop. Pillar 7. The Doctrine of Forever. I opened it and I read what my brother had written, and when I finished I understood why he'd spent the last 3 years of his life wrestling with a question he couldn't answer. I understood why he'd kept these documents hidden, and I understood, finally, what had broken his heart. Pillar 7 was different from the others. The first 6 folders had been filled with spreadsheets, printouts, financial analyses, the cold language of numbers and returns. This folder contained only handwritten pages, David's handwriting cramped and careful, covering both sides of lined yellow legal paper. It wasn't a financial analysis. It was a confession. Marcus, he wrote, I've shown you how the machine works. The tithing, the investments, the land, the growth strategy, the labor, all of it legal, all of it effective, all of it hidden in plain sight from the members who fund it. But you need to understand why. You need to understand what the men at the top believe they're doing. Because if you don't understand the why, you'll think this is about greed. It's not about greed. It's about something far more complicated. It's about the end of the world. I read those words 3 times before I continued. The end of the world. My brother, the financial analyst, the numbers man, the most rational person I'd ever known, writing about the apocalypse. But as I kept reading, I began to understand. In Latter-day Saint theology, we believe in the second coming of Jesus Christ, not as a metaphor or a distant abstraction, but as a literal future event. Christ will return to earth. He will establish his kingdom, and his people, the faithful saints, will be called upon to build Zion, a holy city, a place of refuge for the righteous during the tribulations that precede the millennium. This isn't fringe doctrine. It's central to everything we believe. It's why we store food and water. It's why we're taught to stay out of debt. It's why we build temples across the earth, because in the last days temple work will accelerate, and the living and the dead will need to be prepared for Christ's return. David's document showed me something I'd never considered. The church's financial strategy is built on this belief. They're not hoarding wealth, David wrote. They're preparing for the millennium. They believe, genuinely, sincerely believe, that a time is coming when the world's financial systems will collapse, when governments will fail, when chaos will reign. And when that happens, the church needs to be ready. It needs land to grow food. It needs reserves to sustain its members. It needs infrastructure that doesn't depend on banks or governments or any outside institution. They're building an ark, Marcus, a financial ark, and they believe they're doing it for God. I sat with that for a long time. Here's what made it so difficult. I understood the logic. I'd been raised with the same beliefs. I'd heard General Conference talks about preparing for difficult times. I'd filled my own pantry with wheat and rice and canned goods, just like my parents did, just like their parents did before them. The impulse to prepare, to protect, to build reserves against an uncertain future, that impulse was woven into my DNA as a Latter-day Saint. But there's a difference between a family storing a year's supply of food and an institution accumulating $200 billion while its members clean toilets for free. David addressed this in his notes. The doctrine of stewardship teaches that we're caretakers, not owners. Everything belongs to God. We're just managing it for Him. And the brethren, the men who run the church, believe they're the ultimate stewards. They believe they're managing God's resources for God's purposes. When you believe that, everything changes. Accumulating wealth isn't greed, it's obedience. Hiding the size of your reserves isn't deception, it's prudence. Asking members to sacrifice while you invest their contributions in hedge funds isn't hypocrisy, it's wisdom. Because you believe you're building something that will outlast nations. You believe you're preparing for a day when paper money will be worthless and government bonds will be defaulted, and the only things that matter will be land and food and the loyalty of believers. You believe you're saving the world. I thought about the men I'd seen at David's funeral, the General Authority 70s in their dark suits, the member of the presiding bishopric who'd spoken about David's faithful service. These weren't villains. They weren't con men. They were believers, true believers, who had devoted their lives to building what they genuinely thought was God's kingdom on earth. And that was what made it so hard. If they were simply corrupt, I could dismiss them. If they were obviously fraudulent, I could condemn them. But they weren't. They were faithful men doing what they sincerely believed was right. They were building an institution designed to survive the end of the world, and they were using every tool at their disposal, financial, demographic, organizational, to ensure that when the chaos came, the church would still be standing. The question David couldn't answer was the one he'd posed at the very beginning. Is it wrong to build a kingdom if you truly believe it will save the world? I don't have an answer either. But I've thought about it every day since I read his letter. Here's what I keep coming back to. Sincerity doesn't equal righteousness. You can genuinely believe you're doing God's work and still cause tremendous harm. You can build an institution with the best of intentions and still create something that exploits the very people it claims to serve. The widow in our ward who cleans houses and pays tithing before she buys groceries. She believes she's storing up treasures in heaven. And maybe she is. But she doesn't know that her treasures are being invested in Nvidia stock by professional money managers who earn salaries she'll never see. She doesn't know that the fund her contributions flow into is larger than the endowments of Harvard, Yale, and Stanford combined. She doesn't know that the church could operate for decades on investment returns alone, without collecting another dollar in tithing. Is that fair? Is that honest? Is that what Christ meant when he praised the widow's mite? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. David's final pages were the hardest to read. They weren't analysis anymore. They were grief. I've given my life to this church, Marcus. 23 years in the financial division, 23 years watching the fund grow, managing the investments, keeping the secrets. I've sat in meetings where we discussed strategies for avoiding disclosure. I've signed documents that hid our holdings from regulators. I've done things I'm not proud of, things I justified because I believed in the mission. But somewhere along the way, I lost something. I lost the ability to feel the Spirit the way I used to. I lost the peace I used to feel in the temple. I lost my certainty that the men I worked for were guided by revelation. I still believe in God, Marcus. I still believe in Christ. I still believe the Book of Mormon is true and Joseph Smith was a prophet. But I don't know anymore if the institution I served is the same thing as the gospel I love. Maybe that's the hardest truth of all. The church is true, but the church is also a corporation. The gospel is pure, but the institution that carries it is made of men. Men with agendas and blind spots and the capacity for self-deception that all men have. I couldn't reconcile those two things. I tried for years, and I failed. And now I'm leaving this box for you because I need someone to know. I need someone to understand why I stopped sleeping, why I stopped eating, why I looked at Catherine some mornings and couldn't remember why I'd married her or what any of it meant. I'm not asking you to do anything with this information. I'm not asking you to go public or file complaints or become an activist. I'm just asking you to know, to carry this with me, even after I'm gone. To understand that your brother loved the gospel and loved the church and was destroyed by the distance between them. The letter ended there. No signature, No closing. Just those words, and then blank paper. I sat in my office for a long time after I finished reading. The sun had moved across the sky and the shadows in the room had shifted. Linda had come down twice to check on me, and both times I'd told her I needed a few more minutes. She knew something was wrong. She could see it in my face, but she gave me space the way she always has, trusting that I'd tell her when I was ready. But I wasn't ready. I'm still not ready. If this story moved you, and you'd like to support more content like this, content that explores the questions we carry in silence, there's a link in the description and pinned comment where you can buy me a coffee. Every contribution helps keep these stories alive. 3 months have passed since I first opened that box. The documents are still in my office, stored in the same banker's box David packed them in. I've read them all multiple times. I've verified the numbers against public sources. I've cross-referenced David's claims with investigative journalism and independent analyses and SEC filings. Everything checks out. Everything he wrote was true, and I still don't know what to do with it. I thought about going public, contacting a journalist, becoming a whistleblower like David Nielsen, the former Ensign Peak manager who filed the IRS complaint. I thought about standing up in fast and testimony meeting and telling my ward what I'd learned, watching their faces as they absorbed the numbers, the scope, the staggering scale of what's been built with their contributions. But I didn't do any of those things, and I'm not sure I ever will. Because here's what I've realized. Exposing the church's finances won't change anything. The information is already out there. The Washington Post wrote about it. The SEC investigated. 60 Minutes did a segment. Anyone who wants to know can find out. The church paid a $5 million fine, issued a statement expressing regret for mistakes made, and moved on. The fund kept growing. The tithing kept flowing. The machine kept running. People believe what they need to believe. I know this because I was one of them. For 35 years, I believed that my tithing was building temples and feeding the hungry and spreading the gospel to every nation. I believed it because believing it made my sacrifices meaningful. I believed it because the alternative, that I'd given $400,000 to an institution that didn't need it and wouldn't tell me what it was doing with it, was too painful to contemplate. Most members will never read what I've read. And even if they did, most would find ways to rationalize it. They'd say the brethren know what they're doing. They'd say we should trust in the Lord's plan. They'd say the church needs reserves for the last days, for the building of Zion, for purposes we can't understand with our mortal minds. And maybe they're right. Maybe I'm the one who's lost. Maybe David was wrong, and the doubt that consumed him was a failure of faith rather than an awakening of conscience. I don't know anymore. I don't know much of anything anymore. Last week I drove to the Mesa, Arizona temple. It was a Tuesday afternoon, quiet, hardly anyone around. I parked in the lot and walked to the grounds, and I stood there for a long time, looking at the building I'd loved my whole life. The temple was white against the Arizona sky, its spires reaching upward like hands in prayer. The gardens were immaculate, flowers blooming, fountains running, paths swept clean. It was beautiful. It's always been beautiful. I thought about my wedding day, Linda in her white dress, me in my rented suit, nervous and young and absolutely certain I was making the right choice. I thought about the ceilings of our children, each one kneeling at the altar, making covenants they were too young to fully understand. I thought about my mother's funeral, the comfort of knowing she was sealed to my father, that families can be together forever, that death isn't the end. Those experiences were real. The feelings I had were real, the connections I made, the peace I felt, the sense of being part of something eternal. All of it was real. But so were the numbers. So was the fund. So was the $100 billion growing to $200 billion, compounding year after year while missionaries paid for their own service and widows paid tithing on Social Security checks and families scrubbed toilets on Saturday mornings. Both things were true. The sacred and the institutional. The pure and the compromised, the gospel of Jesus Christ and the corporation that carries its name. I stood there until the sun began to set, painting the temple walls in shades of gold and pink, and then I walked back to my car, drove home, and sat down in my office with the box of documents still waiting on the shelf. I haven't opened it since, but I haven't thrown it away either. Some days I think I should burn it all. Let the questions die with David. Go back to church and sing the hymns and pass the sacrament and pretend I never learned what I learned. Other days, I think I should send copies to every journalist in the country, force the conversation, make the institution answer for what it's built. Most days I do neither, I just live with it. Just live. I carry the weight of knowing what I know, and I go to church on Sunday, and I sit in the pew where I've sat for 30 years, and I look at the people around me, my friends, my neighbors, my family, and I wonder how many of them are carrying their own boxes, their own doubts, their own questions they're afraid to ask. David's letter asked whether it's wrong to build a kingdom if you truly believe it will save the world. I've thought about that question every day for 3 months, and I've finally arrived at something like an answer. I don't think the question is about the builders. I think it's about the bricks. We're the bricks, Marcus. The members, the missionaries, the tithing payers and toilet scrubbers and Saturday morning volunteers. We're what the kingdom is built from. And we were never asked if we wanted to be part of this structure. We were never shown the blueprints. We were never told how tall the tower would grow or what it was really for. We just gave, and gave, and gave. Because we believed. Because we loved. Because we trusted. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Maybe that's what separates the sacred from the institutional, not the buildings or the budgets or the investment returns, but the simple, vulnerable, achingly human act of giving yourself to something larger than yourself. The church didn't build wealth by accident. It built wealth by belief, and belief, I've learned, is the most powerful currency on earth. It can move mountains. It can also move billions. I put David's letter back in the box. I closed the lid. I placed it on the shelf in my closet, behind the old missionary journals and the family photo albums and all the other artifacts of a life I'm still trying to understand. Maybe one day I'll know what to do with it. Maybe one day I'll find the courage to speak or the peace to stay silent. But not today. Today I just sat with the weight of knowing what I know and understanding finally why my brother carried it alone for so long.